In the quiet hills of Texas, a deadly game of cat and mouse is about to unfold. Three desperate men have just escaped from State Penitentiary, led by the ruthless Jackson Miller. Their target, a remote ranch owned by what they believe is just another aging cowboy. They couldn't be more wrong. Carl "Deadeye" Henderson isn't your typical rancher. For 3 decades, he was the most celebrated marksman in competitive shooting history, with 12 national championships and records that still stand unbroken. His precision at 1,000 yards became legend. His ability to split playing cards at 200 yards made him a living myth in shooting circles. Now these escaped convicts are about to learn the hard way that some legends never lose their edge, and some old cowboys never forget how to shoot. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dawn painted the Texas sky in watercolor hues as Carl Henderson walked his fence line, his boots leaving precise tracks in the morning dew. At 72, he moved with the fluid grace that had once made him the most celebrated marksman in competitive shooting history. His ranch, the Double H, spread across 800 acres of rolling Texas hill country, every distance mentally marked and measured in his mind. His morning ritual hadn't changed in 15 years. Check the fences, tend to the cattle, then make his way to the private shooting range hidden behind the barn. The range was a masterpiece of engineering, with targets set at precisely calculated distances from 25 to 1,000 yards. Most visitors mistook it for just another pasture. Inside the ranch house, Carl's study told the real story of the man locals simply called the Old Cowboy. Between traditional ranch photographs hung the evidence of his legendary career: 12 national championship medals, carefully preserved targets showing impossibly tight shot groups, and a faded photograph of him accepting the president's 100 tab. One of marksmanship's highest honors. His hands, weathered by age and ranch work, still moved with surgical precision as he conducted his daily weapon maintenance. The custom 1911 pistol he'd used to set the rapid-fire record in '83 gleamed in the morning light. 10 shots, 10 bullseyes, 6.2 seconds, a record that still stood unbroken. The local hands who worked his cattle never noticed how his eyes constantly measured distances, calculated trajectories, factored in wind conditions. They didn't know about the logbooks he'd kept for 15 years, recording every variable that could affect a precision shot. To them, he was just a successful rancher, maybe a bit peculiar about his routines. Even his house reflected his expertise. Every window had been positioned to provide clear fields of fire. The rocking chair on his front porch sat exactly 25 yards from the main gate, a distance he could shoot blindfolded. The seemingly decorative weather vane on his roof was actually a precision wind indicator. Carl finished his morning maintenance and moved to the kitchen, pouring coffee into a mug from his last championship. Through the window, he watched his cattle grazing peacefully. Most mornings, he'd spend an hour practicing before the day's ranch work began. Not showing off, just maintaining the skills that had made him a legend. The radio on his counter crackled, with local news, mostly church socials and high school football scores. But a breaking news bulletin cut through the morning routine. 3 dangerous inmates escaped from State Penitentiary overnight, led by convicted armed robber Jackson Miller. The men are considered extremely dangerous. Residents are advised. 2. Carl's hand instinctively brushed his hip, where his Colt Single Action Army revolver rode in its worn leather holster. It wasn't the competition gun he'd used to set records. This was an older piece, one that had belonged to his father. But like all his firearms, he maintained it to competition standards. Looking out across his land, Carl allowed himself a small smile. In town, they called him Old Man Henderson. Assuming age had dulled his skills, they didn't know about his morning practice sessions, or how he could still put 5 shots through the same hole at distances that made younger men question their rangefinders. The sun climbed higher, promising another hot Texas day. To anyone watching, Carl Henderson appeared to be just another aging rancher starting his daily routine, but his eyes never stopped scanning, measuring, calculating, habits born from decades of competitive shooting at the highest levels. Some skills never fade, they just wait quietly until they're needed. Sheriff Tom Riley's patrol car kicked up dust as it approached the Double H Ranch. He found Carl at his morning practice, watching through binoculars as the old rancher made adjustments to a target nearly half a mile away. Even from this distance, the sheriff could see all 5 shots had hit dead center. "Some folks in town think you've lost your edge," Tom called out, climbing from his car. "Reckon they'd change their minds if they saw that grouping." Carl lowered his binoculars, a slight smile crossing his weathered face. "Folks in town have short memories, Tom. Coffee's fresh if you want some." The two men had known each other for 15 years, ever since Tom had taken the sheriff's badge. He'd been skeptical at first about the stories he'd heard, tales of impossible shots and unbroken records. Then he'd witnessed Carl shoot a rattlesnake, threatening a ranch hand's dog at 300 yards, using iron sights and fighting a crosswind. "Heard about the prison break?" Tom asked, accepting a steaming mug. "Radio's been full of it all morning. 3 men, including Jackson Miller." Miller's been asking questions in town about local ranchers who lives alone, who might have cash on hand. Carl nodded, his eyes scanning the horizon with practiced ease. "Figured they might head this way. Remote location, old man living alone. Probably looks like an easy target." Emma Watson, Carl's nearest neighbor and local veterinarian, pulled up in her truck. At 35, she represented the new generation of ranchers, but she'd learned to respect the old-timers' wisdom. She'd also learned to read the signs others missed. "Your cattle are clustered in the south pasture," she noted, joining them. "They only do that when strangers are around." Carl's hand moved casually to his revolver, checking it out of habit. "South fence backs up to the old Miller property. Lots of cover there. Good approach if someone's trying to stay hidden." Tom watched the old marksman's eyes map the terrain, noting distances and firing positions with unconscious expertise. "Want me to post some deputies out here?" "Might spook them off," Carl replied. "Better to let them think they've found an easy mark." Emma understood the implications. "They don't know about your background, do they? About the championships?" "Most folks these days don't," Carl said, his voice carrying decades of earned confidence. "Sometimes that's an advantage." The morning wore on, and both Tom and Emma had duties elsewhere. As they prepared to leave, the sheriff paused. "Carl, Miller's dangerous. Shot 2 guards during a robbery 10 years ago. Don't take any chances." Carl's response was interrupted by the distant sound of breaking glass from the direction of his storage shed. All 3 turned toward the noise, but only Carl's trained eye caught the brief flash of movement in the tree line. "Might want to head into town," he told his visitors quietly. "Day's fixing to get interesting." Tom recognized the change in the old rancher's demeanor. The casual manner had shifted, replaced by the focused precision that had made him a legend in shooting circles. "I'll put extra patrols on the back roads. You'll call if you need anything?" "Always do," Carl replied, though they both knew he wouldn't. After they left, Carl began his preparations. To anyone watching, he appeared to be going about his normal routine, but each movement was calculated, each position carefully chosen. He'd maintained his skills not for competition or glory, but for moments like this. His custom rifle, the one that had won him his last championship, came out of its case. The well-oiled action whispered as he worked it, checking the magazine and adjusting the scope. Some men might worry about facing 3 desperate convicts alone, but Carl Henderson had spent a lifetime perfecting the art of precision shooting, and age hadn't changed that one bit. The sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist. To the untrained eye, the old cowboy seemed to be simply going about his daily tasks. But those who knew what to look for would have seen something else. A master marksman preparing his workspace, setting the stage for a demonstration of skills that had made him a living legend. After his visitors left, Carl made his way to the hidden room behind his study's oak panels. The space smelled of gun oil and history, lined with the tools and trophies of a lifetime of precision shooting. His fingers traced the glass case holding his most cherished possession, the bolt-action Winchester Model 70 that had won him his first national championship in 1969. The trophy beside it still caught the morning light. Carl Deadeye Henderson, perfect 1,000-yard score, 1969 National Championships. He remembered that day with crystal clarity. The crosswind had been treacherous, gusting unpredictably. Other shooters had struggled, but he'd read the conditions perfectly, placing all 20 shots in a group smaller than a playing card. His hands moved to a worn leather journal, its pages filled with meticulous notes spanning decades. Between ballistic tables and wind calculations were entries that told the story of his journey. June 15, 1969, first national championship. Judge said he'd never seen shooting like that. August 3, 1972, exhibition shot at State Fair, split 7 playing cards at 200 yards. May 22, 1975, set new rapid-fire record. 10 shots, 10 bullseyes, impossible, they said. September 12, 1980, demonstrated long-range techniques for Army marksmanship unit. A yellowed newspaper clipping caught his eye. Henderson does the impossible, makes mile shot in dust storm. The article described how he'd made a shot other marksmen declared impossible, reading wind conditions that had grounded helicopters. Carl had walked away from competition 15 years ago after his 12th national championship. The sport was changing, becoming more about equipment than skill. Young shooters relied on electronic aids and computer calculations. Carl preferred the old ways, reading wind by watching grass move, calculating distances by eye, letting experience guide. Each shot, he'd chosen this ranch carefully, not just for the cattle business, but for its natural shooting lanes. The rolling hills provided perfect positions, the varying winds kept his skills sharp, and the long valleys offered challenges that most shooting ranges couldn't match. Through the window, he spotted movement at his property line. Just a deer, but his hands automatically measured the distance. 486 yards, slight crosswind from the west, about 3 minutes of angle adjustment needed. Some habits never died. The radio crackled with another update about the escaped prisoners. Carl listened while checking his revolver, the action smooth from decades of daily maintenance. He'd chosen this quiet life deliberately, wanting peace, but never letting his skills fade. Every morning, before the sun cleared the hills, he still put 50 rounds through his rifles at ranges that would make most marksmen nervous. A distant crow's call snapped him back to the present. Through his window, he could see storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Weather was moving in, and maybe something else. His hand moved to check his revolver again, a habit born from countless hours of competition preparation. Most people saw what they expected to see. Just another old rancher, maybe a bit peculiar with his security measures, living out his quiet. Years with his cattle and his memories. They didn't see the man who could hit a target the size of a quarter at ranges where most people couldn't even see the target. The storm clouds drew closer as Carl finished his preparations. In the distance, thunder rolled across the Texas hills like rifle fire, bringing back memories of other challenges, other tests of skill. He'd faced them all with the same steady calm that had made him a legend in the shooting world. Now, as he sensed trouble approaching his sanctuary, that same calm settled over him like an old familiar coat. Some men might worry about facing 3 desperate convicts alone, but Carl Henderson had spent a lifetime perfecting the art of the perfect shot, and age hadn't changed that one bit. Let them come. They'd learn what the shooting world had known for decades. There was a lot more to the old cowboy than met the eye. The first signs were subtle, the kind most people would miss. Carl noticed them only because of habits ingrained through decades of competitive shooting, where the smallest details could mean the difference between victory and defeat. His cattle had shifted their grazing pattern, clustering away from the south fence line. Birds that usually settled in the old oak grove had gone silent. Through his precision spotting scope, Carl studied the tree line where his property met the abandoned Miller place. 3 sets of tracks crossed the muddy creek bed, fresh ones made within the last hour. The stride patterns suggested men in a hurry, trying to move quietly, but lacking the patience to do it right. His radio crackled. "Carl," Emma's voice carried an edge of concern. "You might want to check your south storage shed. Just drove past and noticed the lock's been cut. Definitely wasn't like that this morning." "Copy that," Carl replied quietly, already calculating angles and distances in his mind. "You get somewhere safe?" "At the sheriff's office. Tom's organizing search parties, but—" She hesitated. "They found a guard's body near the prison, shot at close range. These aren't just escapees anymore." Carl's jaw tightened. He'd seen the guard around town, young Andy Parker, barely 25, always respectful to his elders. "Stay put," he told Emma. "I'll handle things here." Moving with the smooth precision that had once made him famous in shooting circles, Carl made his way to the storage shed. The lock hadn't just been cut, it had been done with skill, minimizing damage. Inside, his tool rack had been picked clean. Of anything that could serve as a weapon, boot prints in the dust told a story his trained eye could read like a book. 3 men, one favoring his left leg slightly. They'd been methodical in their search, checking every corner. These weren't ordinary prisoners acting on impulse. They had a plan. His hand instinctively checked his revolver as he scanned the horizon. The sun was lowering, creating what competitive shooters called the golden hour, when light and shadow played tricks on the eye, when experience mattered more than raw talent. The radio came alive again. "Carl, it's Tom. Just got word from Wilson's store. 3 men matching our fugitive's description, bought supplies, asked specific questions about local ranches." "Let me guess," Carl replied, already knowing the answer. "Mine came up in conversation. Miller was doing most of the talking, said something about easy pickings, teaching some lessons. I've got units heading your way, but they're at least 30 minutes out." A slight smile crossed Carl's weathered face. "Might want to tell them not to hurry. Could get complicated if they show up at the wrong moment." Back at the house, Carl moved with practiced efficiency. From a hidden compartment beneath his gun room came equipment he hadn't touched since his competition days. Precision rangefinders, wind indicators, and the logbook containing 15 years of documented weather patterns for every significant point on his property. Through his window, movement caught his eye, a flash of color at the edge of his south pasture. 3 figures, trying to use the terrain for cover. They were good, better than typical convicts, but to Carl's experienced eye, their positions might as well have been marked with neon signs. The radio crackled one more time. "Hey, old-timer!" The voice was rough, confident. Jackson Miller himself. "Figured we'd give you fair warning. Way I hear it, you're sitting on a nice retirement fund. Play this smart, you might walk away from it." Carl didn't respond. Instead, he settled into his rocking chair on the front porch, positioned exactly where he wanted to be. The evening wind carried the scent of approaching rain, heavy with moisture. A competitive shooter would know how that would affect long-range shots, how to adjust for the changing air density. A rifle shot cracked through the twilight, sending splinters flying from the porch post 6 inches from Carl's head. A warning shot, deliberately placed. Amateur move. In competition, you learned quickly that showing your hand early gave away any advantage. "That's your only warning, old man," Miller's voice carried across the darkening ranch. "Sun's setting on your time." Carl remained in his chair, as calm as he'd been at the start of every championship match. His revolver rested casually across his lap, out of sight, but ready. Here in the growing darkness, he wasn't Carl Henderson, the retired rancher, anymore. He was Dead-Eye Henderson, the man who could thread a needle with a rifle at distances that made other marksmen question their equipment. The man who'd set records that still stood unbroken after all these years. The man who'd never lost his edge, just chose to keep it hidden. Storm clouds gathered overhead as the last light faded. Thunder rolled across the Texas hills like distant gunfire. Soon, these escaped convicts would learn what the competitive shooting world had known for decades. Sometimes the most dangerous marksman was the one who didn't look dangerous at all. The first real test came just as the storm clouds were gathering strength. Miller's group had split up, trying to flank Carl's position from 3 different directions. It was a solid tactical move against a normal target, but Carl Henderson had spent decades learning to track multiple targets under pressure. Through the deepening twilight, his trained eye picked out their movements. The smallest one, probably Joey Martinez, according to the prison break reports, was working his way through the south pasture. The second, matching the description of Pete Wilson, had taken position behind the old tractor near the barn. Miller himself was moving toward the house from the east, using the cover of the approaching storm. "Last chance, old-timer," Miller called out, his voice nearly lost in a rumble of thunder. "Could do this easy, or we could do it hard." Carl's response came in the form of a single precise shot. His revolver barely seemed to move as he fired, but the heavy wrench Wilson had been holding suddenly flew from his hand, spinning away into the darkness. The shot had threaded the narrow gap between the tractor's wheel and frame, catching the tool without endangering the man, a warning shot of his own, but one that demonstrated a level of skill that changed the entire equation. "Jesus Christ," Wilson's startled voice carried clearly. "He didn't even aim." "Shut up," Miller hissed, but uncertainty had crept into his tone. "Lucky shot, old man. Won't get another." Carl's voice, when it came, carried the calm certainty that had won him 12 national championships. "That wasn't luck, Mr. Miller. That was me being polite." He shifted slightly in his rocking chair, causing it to creak ominously in the darkness. "Next shot won't be." Martinez had frozen in the pasture, suddenly aware of how exposed he was. Carl had been tracking him the whole time, noting how the young man's inexperience showed in his movement patterns. "Young fellow in my south pasture," he called out conversationally. "You might want to stay still. Rattler about 6 feet to your left seems mighty interested in all that movement." The frightened yelp and subsequent scrambling told him his warning had hit home. He'd spotted the snake earlier, knew exactly where it was. In his competition days, he'd won more than one match by reading terrain and anticipating how others would move through it. "He's playing with us," Wilson's worried voice carried from behind the tractor. "Nobody shoots like that in the dark." A flash of lightning illuminated the scene for a split second, and Carl used that moment to his advantage. His second shot cracked. Out with the thunder, expertly placed to split the difference between Miller and his planned position of cover. A classic competition technique, anticipating where a target would be rather than where it was. Miller's curse confirmed the psychological impact. The prison break leader had expected an easy target, an old man they could intimidate or overwhelm. Instead, they'd found themselves being systematically outmaneuvered by someone operating on a completely different level. "Might want to reconsider your evening plans," Carl suggested mildly, his voice carrying across the ranch yard, as clearly as if he were calling in wind conditions at a match. "Storm's coming in fast. Be a shame if someone got hurt bumping around in the dark." The 3 intruders had gone quiet, but Carl's trained ear could pick out their movements. They were trying to regroup, to come up with a new plan. But he had the advantage now, not just in skill, but in their growing uncertainty. Rain began to fall, fat drops that would play havoc with amateur shooters' accuracy. But Carl had won the '82 championships in worse conditions, knew exactly how to adjust. For precipitation and changing air density. "What's it going to be, gentlemen?" he asked, his voice barely raised above the growing storm. "We can end this now, nice and peaceful. Or we can find out just how accurate I am when I'm not just sending warnings." The silence that followed was heavy with tension and the growing realization that they had severely miscalculated. They'd come hunting what they thought was easy prey, only to find themselves being hunted instead by a man whose skill with a firearm bordered on the supernatural. Lightning flashed again, and in that brief illumination, Carl caught the look on Miller's face. It was the same expression he'd seen countless times in competition, the moment when an opponent realized they were hopelessly outmatched. Miller's response to Carl's ultimatum came in the form of gunfire. 3 quick shots that showed more desperation than accuracy. Carl had already moved from his rocking chair, anticipating the reaction. In competition, you learn to read your opponents, to know when frustration would overcome judgment. 32 feet left, 18 inches high, Carl called out calmly, noting the shot placement. "Rushing your shots, Mr. Miller. That's what cost you accuracy." A frustrated curse echoed through the darkness. Carl's critique had struck home, pointing out shooting errors the way he used to when judging regional competitions. It was a calculated move, designed to unsettle his opponents further. "Wilson," Miller hissed, not quite quietly enough to escape Carl's trained ear, "circle round back. Martinez, keep him talking." "Boss," Martinez's voice shook slightly, "something ain't right. My daddy used to compete in shooting matches. Said there was this guy, Henderson." "Shut up," Miller snapped, but Carl could hear the sudden uncertainty in his voice. Carl used their discussion to make his own move, sliding silently to a pre-planned position. In the dark, with rain starting to fall, most shooters would be at a serious disadvantage. But he'd practiced this kind of shooting countless times, using the ranch's natural features to maintain his edge. "Your friend's right, Mr. Miller." Carl projected his voice to mask his new location. "Might want to ask him about those competitions, about the records that still stand." A burst of lightning illuminated the scene, and Carl used that moment precisely. His shot threaded between raindrops, striking the ground exactly 1 inch from Wilson's attempted flanking position. The man froze, suddenly realizing how exposed he was. "That'd be your second warning, Mr. Wilson," Carl noted professionally. "Wouldn't recommend a third. Rain's picking up, next shot might not be quite so precise." Martinez had started putting the pieces together. "Boss, I remember now. Deadeye Henderson. Guy could shoot a playing card in half at 200 yards. Won everything back in the day." The revelation hit harder than any bullet. Carl could hear Miller's breathing change as the full implications sank in. They hadn't picked a random target after all. They'd walked right into the kill zone of one of the most legendary marksmen in competitive shooting history. "Could be lying," Miller argued, but his voice lacked conviction. "Could be making it up." Carl's response was another demonstration shot, this one catching the bandana right off Martinez's neck without touching skin. The young man went dead still, feeling the slight breeze of its passage. 412 yards, Carl announced, as if he were calling scores at a match. Adjusting 6 inches for wind drift, 2 minutes elevation for the rain. Would have been easier in daylight, but I've had 15 years to memorize every shooting angle on this ranch. The storm was building now, wind driving the rain in sheets. Most shooters would find accuracy impossible in these conditions. But Carl had won his 6th championship in weather worse than this, had learned to read wind patterns in the way rain fell across his land. "Options are getting limited, gentlemen," he called out, his voice carrying the same steady calm that had intimidated competition shooters for decades. Storms building, visibility's dropping. Soon you'll have to decide, risk dealing with me in weather that only helps my advantage, or make the smart choice. Lightning flashed again, and in that stark illumination, Carl caught Miller's expression, the look of a man realizing he'd walked into a trap. Not just any trap, but one laid by someone operating at a level he hadn't known existed. "You've got 3 seconds to drop your weapons," Carl announced, his tone shifting to the one he'd used when running championship matches. "After that, stop aiming wide." The sound of 2 guns hitting wet dirt came almost immediately. Martinez and Wilson had reached their breaking point. Only Miller held out, his pride warring with his survival instinct. 1, Carl counted calmly, placing a shot that sheared through Miller's belt holster strap. The pistol fell into the mud. 2. Another round kicked up dirt between Miller's feet. Before he could say 3, Miller's hands were in the air. "Don't shoot, we're done." Carl kept his position, watching through the rain as his 3 would-be attackers stood exposed in the storm. They'd come hunting an old man, only to find themselves outmaneuvered by a legend they hadn't known existed. Lightning split the sky as Sheriff Tom Riley's patrol car pulled up to the Double H Ranch. The scene before him told a story few would believe. 3 notorious escaped convicts standing in the rain, hands raised, while Carl Henderson sat calmly, in his rocking chair, revolver resting easily across his lap. "Evening, Tom," Carl called out as if this were a social visit. "Brought you some guests." The sheriff's deputies moved in to secure the prisoners, their movements cautious despite the men's obvious surrender. Miller, his previous bravado gone, kept glancing at Carl with a mixture of fear and disbelief. "You could have killed us at any time," Miller said, as deputies cuffed him. "All those warning shots." "Competition shooting teaches discipline," Carl replied mildly. "Hitting targets is easy. Choosing not to is the hard part." Emma arrived with the second patrol car, her veterinary truck following the commotion. Her eyes widened at the precise shots she could see marked in the wood of the porch post, the barn door, and various points around the yard. Each one placed exactly where it would make its point without causing harm. "Good Lord, Carl," she breathed, examining the pattern. "This is like an exhibition shoot." "Man's a damn ghost," Martinez muttered as he was led to the patrol car. "My daddy used to talk about Deadeye Henderson. Never thought I'd be on the wrong end of that legend." Tom surveyed the scene with professional interest. The shot placement told a story of expertise few would understand. "Want to tell me what happened here?" Carl rose slowly from his chair, his movements unhurried. "Had some uninvited visitors, helped them reconsider their choices." But Miller, being led to the second patrol car, wasn't finished. "This ain't over, old man. Got friends who'll want to know about this. Man with skills like yours, living all alone out here." The threat hung in the air like the lingering thunder. Carl's expression didn't change, but his eyes took on the focus they'd had during championship matches. "Might want to remind your friends," he said quietly, "that what they saw tonight was me being careful, being precise. They might not want to see what happens when I stop worrying about precision." Emma caught the undertone in his voice. "Carl, you should stay with us in town for a few days, just until things settle." "Appreciate the offer," he replied, checking his revolver with practiced movements. "But I've spent 15 years setting this place up just the way I like it. Won't be driven off by threats." Tom understood the implications. Miller had connections, other criminals who might see Carl as either a threat or a challenge. "I'll step up patrols in the area." "No need," Carl said, his voice carrying the same calm certainty he'd had during competitions. "Might be best if folks think tonight was luck. Just an old man getting fortunate." But Miller, watching from the patrol car window, knew better. He'd seen something few lived to talk about. A master at work, someone whose skill with a firearm bordered on supernatural. The word would spread through prison circles, growing with each telling. As the patrol cars pulled away, Emma lingered. "They'll be back, won't they? Or others like them?" Carl watched the storm clouds rolling across his land, calculating distances and wind patterns out of habit. Probably. Man spends his life getting good at something. Eventually someone wants to test themselves against him. And when they come, his smile was slight, but certain. Then they'll learn what every challenger in my competition days learned. Some legends don't fade with age. They just wait quietly until they're needed. The storm was passing now, moving east across the Texas hills. Carl Henderson stood on his porch, seeming to all the world like just another old rancher watching the weather. But his eyes never stopped measuring distances, reading wind patterns, noting potential firing positions. The night's excitement was over, but he knew it was just the beginning. Miller's threat would spread, drawing others who wouldn't believe the stories until they learned the truth for themselves. That was fine by Carl. He had time, skill, and a lifetime of experience teaching overconfident challengers the difference between shooting and marksmanship. Let them come. The old cowboy would be ready. The morning after the confrontation brought unexpected visitors to the Double H Ranch. Carl was checking his fence line when he heard the distinctive rumble of a classic Chevy pickup. He knew who it was before the truck cleared the hill. Only one person he knew still kept a '56 Apache in that particular shade of blue. "Thought you'd be dead by now, Deadeye," called Bill Matthews as he stepped down from the truck. At 75, Bill was one of the few remaining shooters from Carl's competition days, a man who'd taken second place to him more times than either cared to count. "Thought you'd learned to shoot straight by now, Bill," Carl replied, the old banter coming naturally. "What brings you out from Houston?" "News travels fast in certain circles," Bill said, his expression turning serious. "Heard some interesting stories about 3 prison escapees getting a lesson in precision shooting. Figured I'd better check on my old rival." They walked to the house together, their gaits showing the measured pace of men who'd spent lifetimes controlling their movements. Emma's truck was already parked out front, and through the window Carl could see she had company, Sarah Collins, the local newspaper reporter. "Great," Carl muttered. "Just what I need." "Can't keep it quiet, Carl," Bill said softly. "Miller's already talking in custody. Stories spreading through every prison in Texas. Man who can shoot the buttons off your shirt at 400 yards in the dark. That's the kind of tale that draws attention." Inside, Sarah Collins was practically vibrating with excitement. "Mr. Henderson, why didn't you ever tell anyone about your shooting career? 12 national championships, the records that still stand. This is the story of the decade." "And that's exactly why I didn't tell anyone," Carl replied, pouring coffee for Bill. "Lived my whole life in the spotlight. Came here for quiet." "Quiet's not an option anymore," Emma said gently. 3 more strangers stopped by the store this morning asking directions to your ranch. Tom had to run them off." Bill nodded grimly. "You've become a challenge now, Carl. Every hotshot with a gun's going to want to test themselves against the legend." Carl's hand moved to his revolver, checking it out of habit. "Might be testing themselves against more than they bargained for." Sarah was scribbling notes furiously. "Would you at least tell me about some of your championships? The story says you once split 7 playing cards with 7 shots at 200 yards. 8 cards, Bill corrected. "I was there. Called the wind for him that day. Never seen anything like it before or since." Carl's attention was elsewhere. Through his window, he caught movement at the edge of his property, just a deer. But his mind automatically calculated the range, wind conditions, and optimal firing position. "You're still doing it, aren't you?" Bill asked, recognizing the look. "Still keeping sharp?" "Never stopped," Carl admitted. "Range time every morning. Written records of every shot. Some habits you don't want to break." Emma understood suddenly. "That's why you built the ranch this way. Every fence post, every tree line. They're all measured shooting positions, aren't they?" Carl's slight smile confirmed her suspicion. "Ranch needs good security. Might as well make it educational, too." "You're gonna need help," Bill said firmly. "Word I hear, Miller's got connections. Mean ones. They won't come at you straight. Like he did. They'll try to get clever. Already thought of that, Carl replied, moving to his gunroom. He pulled out a worn leather logbook, opening it to reveal pages of meticulous notes. Been mapping every approach to this ranch for 15 years. Every angle, every shadow, every patch of cover. Got backup plans for backup plans. Sarah started to ask another question, but Carl held up his hand. In the distance, another vehicle was approaching, one he didn't recognize. "Company coming," he said quietly. "Bill might want to show these ladies out the back way. Emma knows the route." "Just like old times," Bill grinned, but his hand moved to the rifle in his truck. "Want some backup?" Carl checked his revolver one more time, the action whisper smooth. "From decades of maintenance. Might not be a bad idea, but stay out of sight for now. Let's see what kind of challenge they're bringing this time." The old competitors shared a look of perfect understanding. Sometimes the best shot was the one you didn't have to take, but when you did have to take it, you'd better be ready to make it count. The approaching vehicle turned out to be a false alarm, just a lost tourist asking for directions. But Carl and Bill used the opportunity to walk the property. Two old champions assessing the battlefield with eyes honed by decades of competitive shooting. "You've thought this through," Bill commented, noting how Carl had positioned hay bales to create natural shooting lanes. "Every fence post is exactly measured, isn't it?" 300 yards to the north gate, Carl confirmed, pointing. 450 to the ridgeline, 600 to the old oak. Got range cards buried in weatherproof cases every 100 yards. Wind indicators hidden in the trees looked like old wind chimes. They paused at the barn, where Carl had subtly modified the structure over the years. "Reinforce the walls," he explained, opening a hidden panel. "Created shooting ports that looked like ventilation. Put in elevated positions that seem like regular storage lofts." "Paranoid as ever," Bill chuckled, but his eyes showed approval. "Though I guess it's not paranoia if they're really coming for you." Emma's truck returned, this time without Sarah Collins. "Tom just called," she reported, joining them. "Miller's lawyer visited him in custody. An hour later, 3 known associates of the Cortez gang were seen asking questions in town." "Cortez?" Bill whistled low. "They're the ones who control most of the gun running through South Texas. Professional shooters in that bunch." Carl nodded, unsurprised. "Figure they'll want to test the legend themselves. Probably think an old man getting lucky against Miller is one thing. Going up against trained shooters is another." They moved to Carl's gunroom, where he began his methodical preparation. Each weapon was checked, cleaned, and positioned strategically around the property. Hidden caches were verified, ammunition counts confirmed. Teaching them a lesson might not be enough this time, Bill warned, helping to sight in a backup rifle. "Cortez gang doesn't take kindly to humiliation." "That's why we're not going to humiliate them," Carl replied, making a minute adjustment to his scope. "We're going to educate them, show them exactly why some legends are best left alone." Emma watched the two old shooters work, noting how their movements mirrored each other. Decades of competition creating a shared language of precision and preparation. "What do you need from me?" "Eyes and ears in town," Carl said. "You're the vet. Got reason to be driving around at all hours. Notice things. Let us know when they make their move." Bill added his own preparations, setting up subtle warning systems. Tripwires that looked like random fence repair. Pressure plates disguised as normal ground cover. "Just like match preparation," he commented. "Control the environment, control the outcome." Carl's phone buzzed, a text from Sheriff Thompson. 3 more strangers checked into the motel, expensive trucks, gun cases, claiming they're here for hunting. "Wrong season for hunting," Emma observed. "Unless they're hunting something specific," Carl replied, his voice dry. "Bill, remember that exhibition shoot in '82? The one where we had to deal with multiple moving targets? The one where you showed off by hitting them in order of height rather than position? Never could figure out how you tracked them all at once. About to need those skills again." Carl moved to his loading bench, beginning the precise process of hand-loading ammunition. Each cartridge was measured exactly, each powder charge weighed to match the conditions he expected to face. Emma understood suddenly. You're not just preparing to defend yourself, you're setting up another exhibition shoot. Best way to deal with professional shooters, Carl confirmed, is to show them what real precision looks like. Make them understand the difference between being good with a gun and being a true marksman. The day wore on as they prepared, each detail checked and double-checked. Carl's ranch was becoming something more than a simple cattle operation. It was transforming into a master marksman's ultimate shooting gallery, with angles and positions calculated to showcase a lifetime of expertise. They'll come at night, Bill predicted, helping to set up subtle lighting positions. Think darkness will give them the advantage. Let them, Carl replied, adjusting a mirror that would reflect moonlight exactly where he wanted it. Sometimes, the best way to teach a lesson is to let your students think they have the upper hand, right up until they learn they don't. As the sun began to set, Carl stood on his porch, watching the changing light paint new shadows across his land. To any observer, he looked like just another rancher ending his day. But his mind was calculating trajectories, memorizing how the dying light played across his carefully prepared positions. The Cortez gang was coming, bringing their professional shooters to test the legend of Deadeye Henderson. They'd find more than just an old cowboy waiting for them. They'd find a master of precision shooting who'd spent 15 years turning his entire ranch into the ultimate shooting range. Getting too old for this, Bill joked, but his eyes showed the same anticipation they'd had before big matches. Age just means we've had more time to practice, Carl replied, his hand resting comfortably on his revolver. The same calm that had won him 12 championships settled over him as the light faded. The stage was set, the positions prepared. Now all they needed were the students to arrive for their lesson in true marksmanship. They came just after midnight, announcing their presence with a shot that shattered Carl's porch light. It was a precise shot, professionally executed, meant to show they weren't common thugs like Miller's crew. Carl, watching through his night vision, scope, noted the shooter's position with professional appreciation. 800 yards, using the ridge for elevation, he murmured to Bill, who was stationed in the reinforced barn. Catch the muzzle flash? Workshop roof, Bill confirmed through their radio link. Got at least 2 more in the tree line. These boys know their business. Good. Carl's voice held the same calm focus he'd had during championship matches. Hate to go through all this preparation for amateurs. Emma's voice crackled over their secure channel. 2 vehicles just turned off the main road, heading your way with lights off. Tom's keeping his deputies back unless you signal. The next shot came from a different position. Closer, but still precise. A window exploded in Carl's guest room, exactly where someone would expect an old man to be sleeping. These weren't random shots, they were methodical, professional. Time to teach our first lesson, Carl said quietly. He'd been waiting for this shot, had calculated the angles days ago. His rifle spoke once, the sound absorbed by the custom suppressors he'd installed. 200 yards away, an expensive night vision scope shattered, leaving one of the Cortez shooters effectively blind. Jesus! The man's startled curse carried clearly. He shot the scope clean off. Wasn't even a vital shot, Bill commented, admiring the precision, just letting them know what they're dealing with. A new voice boomed across the ranch, carrying the authority of command. Henderson, I am Raul Cortez. Perhaps we can discuss this situation like professionals. Like the professionals who shoot up an old man's house? Carl's reply was calm, conversational. Not very sporting, Mr. Cortez. You humiliated our associates. This requires attention. Carl's response was another demonstration shot. The coffee cup in Cortez's hand exploded, despite him being barely visible in the darkness. Attention to detail is important in our profession, Carl called out. "For instance, I can tell your shooter on the north ridge is favoring his right side. Old wound, perhaps, affects his stance." The stunned silence that followed was profound. Carl had just casually revealed that he could not only see them in the darkness, but could detect minute details about their shooting positions. "Impossible," someone whispered, loud enough to carry. "No one shoots like that. That's why they called him Deadeye," Bill broadcast on an open channel, letting them hear. 12 championships wasn't luck, boys. You're playing in a league. You don't understand." As if to emphasize the point, Carl fired 3 rapid shots. 3 different rifles, held by 3 different shooters, were struck with surgical precision. Not destroyed, just tagged with perfect shots that would leave unmistakable marks on their barrels. "Mr. Cortez," Carl called out, his voice still. "I'm friendly. I've spent 15 years preparing this ranch for nights like this. Every distance is measured, every angle calculated. Your men are good, professional good, but they're standing exactly where I've practiced shooting every morning for the past decade." The tension in the darkness was palpable. The Cortez gang had come to teach a lesson, only to find themselves in someone else's classroom. "We have you surrounded," Cortez tried, but his voice lacked conviction. "No, sir," Carl replied mildly. "You're surrounded by a shooting gallery I've spent years perfecting. Every shadow you think is covering you, I helped create. Every position you think is secure, I've got range down to the inch." To demonstrate, he fired once more. The shot threaded between 2 shooters, striking a tree behind them exactly where a playing card had been pinned during his morning practice. "That's the thing about being a champion," Carl continued, as casual as if he were giving a shooting clinic. "It's not about being good on the day, it's about practicing until you can't miss, then practicing more until missing isn't even a possibility." The night had become very quiet. Professional gunmen were reassessing their positions, realizing that what they'd thought was a simple intimidation job had become something else entirely. They'd come hunting a legend, only to find the legend had been waiting for them, ready to demonstrate why some reputations are built on more than just stories. The night had grown quiet, too quiet for Carl's experienced senses. The Cortez gang's professional shooters had gone silent after his demonstration, but something wasn't right. Years of competitive shooting had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now, those instincts were screaming. "Bill," he whispered into his radio, "something's off. They're too quiet." Before Bill could respond, Emma's urgent voice crackled through their channel. "Carl, we've got trouble. Big trouble. Tom just found out. There's a leak in the department. Someone's been feeding the Cortez gang information about your property." Carl's mind raced through the implications. The shooters' positions had been too good, too precise. They'd known exactly where to target, which approaches to take. "Who?" "Deputy Walker," Emma replied, her voice tight. "He's been on their payroll for months. And Carl, he has all of Tom's surveillance photos of your ranch, all the patrol reports, every documented security measure." The revelation hit hard. Deputy James Walker had been out to his ranch dozens of times, always friendly, always interested in Carl's security setup, always taking pictures for the department's files. "That's not all," Emma continued. "Walker's missing, and the department's weapons locker was cleaned out an hour ago. They've got police-grade tactical gear, night vision equipment, a new sound cut through the night, the distinctive whir of professional drones, not just one, but several, creating a coordinated surveillance network above his property. The kind of equipment only law enforcement was supposed to have. They're mapping your shooting positions," Bill warned, "using thermal imaging to track our locations." Carl's mind shifted into the same analytical mode that had won him his championships. New variables meant new calculations, new strategies. "Emma, get word to Tom. Tell him to keep his people back. This just got a lot more complicated." Through his scope, Carl caught movement at the edge of his property, tactical teams moving with professional precision, using the kind of coordinated approach that spoke of police or military training. Walker had taught them exactly how to counter Carl's defenses. "Mr. Henderson," Walker's voice boomed through a police bullhorn. "Feeling less confident now. I've spent months studying your setup, every hiding spot, every prepared position. I know them all." "Figured you for smarter than this, James," Carl replied calmly, though his mind was racing through recalculations. "Cortez money that good?" "Better than a deputy's salary," Walker laughed. "And after tonight, I'll be famous as the man who outsmarted the legendary Deadeye Henderson. We've got your whole place mapped out, old man. Thermal imaging shows exactly where you and your friend are hiding." Carl's response was typical of his style, a single shot that disabled the nearest drone with surgical precision. 15 years of preparation, Deputy. You really think I showed you everything?" But Walker's laugh held genuine confidence. "Actually, yes. See, I didn't just study your property. I studied you, studied every competition you ever shot in, analyzed your patterns, your preferences. You're good, maybe the best ever, but you're also predictable. A lifetime of competitive shooting means you do everything by the book." The assessment was professionally sound, and that's what worried Carl most. Walker had done his homework, had approached this like a tactical problem to be solved, and he had dozens of well-armed, well-trained shooters to implement his solution. "Bill," Carl whispered into his radio, "remember that exhibition shoot in '79? The one where the targets all went wrong? The one where you had to improvise everything?" Bill replied quietly. "Thought you hated that day." "Hated it then. Glad for it now. Time to show them what happens when a champion has to break his own rules." Carl's hand moved to his belt, finding a small remote control. Walker had studied his documented security measures, analyzed his known shooting positions, but he hadn't known about the backup plans, the ones Carl had created for scenarios he'd hoped would never happen. "Last chance to walk away, James," Carl called out. "What you documented, what you studied, that was just the surface, the parts I was willing to let people see." Walker's response was to order his teams to advance. They moved with tactical precision, clearly visible now in their police-grade night vision gear. Everything was going according to their carefully planned assault, and that's when Carl pressed the remote. Across his property, hidden systems activated. Irrigation sprinklers burst to life, not spraying water, but creating precise patterns of mist that played havoc with thermal imaging. Solar-powered lights, concealed in the ground, activated in scattered patterns designed to disrupt night vision equipment. "Problem with studying old competitions," Carl announced calmly, "is you only learn the rules. Champions, we learn when to break them." The night erupted into chaos, but it was chaos by design. Every backup system Carl had hidden over 15 years activated in sequence, transforming his ranch into something entirely different from what Walker had documented. The carefully mapped shooting lanes disappeared, replaced by new ones that only Carl knew about. Walker's confident laugh had turned to frustrated cursing. His perfect tactical assault was falling apart as his teams lost their technological advantage. They'd prepared to face a legendary competitive shooter, only to discover that the legend had evolved beyond his reputation. "Sometimes," Carl said, softly, though he knew they could all hear him, "the best shot isn't the one you've practiced 1,000 times. Sometimes it's the one you never let anyone see you practice at all." The ranch had transformed into a battlefield unlike anything Walker or the Cortez gang had prepared for. Their tactical advantage, built on months of careful observation, was evaporating in the face of Carl's hidden preparations. But the old champion knew the real test was just beginning. "They're regrouping," Bill reported through their radio link, "splitting into smaller teams, trying to adapt to the new conditions." "Let them," Carl replied, moving to one of his backup positions, one that hadn't existed in any of Walker's surveillance photos. Adaptation under pressure separates professionals from champions. Emma's voice crackled through their comms. Tom's got state police on the way, but they're at least an hour out. He says Walker disabled most of the department's vehicles before he left. Through his scope, Carl watched the tactical teams adjusting their approach. They were good. He had to give them that. Already shifting to manual targeting as their high-tech. Gear struggled with his countermeasures. Walker had trained them well. Getting awful quiet out there, Henderson, Walker called out. Running out of tricks? Carl's response was a masterclass in precision shooting. 3 shots, fired in rapid succession, struck the tactical lights his opponents were setting up, not destroying them, just adjusting their angles. To work in his favor rather than theirs. 15 years of planning, Carl replied calmly. How many tricks do you think I've got saved up? But Walker's laugh held genuine confidence. Thing about tricks, old man, they're just distractions. While you're busy putting on your show, my teams are moving into positions you never planned. 4. Carl had to admire the strategy. Walker was using his own reputation against him, counting on the methodical nature that had won all those championships. Standard tactical doctrine said to avoid patterns, to stay unpredictable. But Walker had figured out that a lifetime of competitive shooting had given Carl certain habits that could be exploited. Bill, Carl whispered, remember what you used to say about my worst day in competition? The '83 finals? Bill replied. When everything went wrong and you still won? That's the one. Time to show them what happens when Deadeye Henderson has to improvise. Carl reached into his boot, pulling out a small notepad. In it were calculations and firing solutions he'd worked out over years, not for competition, but for scenarios he'd hoped would never happen. Scenarios where the rules didn't matter anymore. Emma, he called softly into his radio, remember those old railroad flares in my barn? Time to put them to use. The ones you said were just for emergencies? She understood immediately. Creating new sightlines, something like that, on my mark 3 minutes apart, random positions. Walker's teams were advancing again, using the cover they'd documented so carefully. They'd studied every shadow, every angle of Carl's property, but they hadn't counted on him changing those angles in the middle of a fight. Through his scope, Carl caught glimpses of their movement. Professional shooters working in coordinated pairs, police-grade tactical gear glinting dully in the darkness. They'd come prepared for a siege, ready to outlast an old man's endurance. Getting tired yet, Henderson? Walker taunted. Can't keep this up forever. Carl's reply was another precise shot. This one splitting the difference between 2 advancing shooters, not trying to hit them, just letting them know he could have. Funny thing about competition shooting, Carl called back, teaches you more than just accuracy. Teaches you patience, planning, and most importantly, he paused as Emma's first flare lit up the night, creating new shadows that weren't in any of Walker's plans. It teaches you how to adapt when everything goes wrong. The night was about to become very interesting. Walker had studied the champion shooter, analyzed every competition, planned for every documented technique. But he'd missed something crucial about Carl Henderson's legend. The real story wasn't about the competitions he'd won. It was about the one competition where everything went wrong, where all his careful preparation had fallen apart, and he'd still emerged victorious by throwing out the rulebook entirely. Now, surrounded by professional shooters with police tactical gear, guided by a man who knew all his standard moves, Carl Henderson was about to show them why some legends grow stronger with age. Remember, Bill? He whispered, checking his weapon. One final time. Sometimes the best shot isn't the one you've practiced. Sometimes it's the one nobody expects you to take. The real battle was about to begin, and this time there wouldn't be any judges to score the results. The flares Emma had lit created a ghostly landscape of shifting shadows and uncertain distances. Walker's carefully mapped firing lanes had become a maze of deception, where every familiar reference point now cast unfamiliar shadows. Through his scope, Carl watched the professional shooters hesitate, their confidence shaken by this transformation of familiar terrain. "They're splitting up again," Bill reported quietly. "Three-man teams, trying to cover more ground." "Exactly what I was hoping for," Carl replied, his voice carrying the same calm focus he'd had during his championship days. "Remember the cardinal rule of competition?" "Never let them dictate the pace," Bill answered, and Carl could hear the smile in his old friend's voice. Emma's voice crackled through their comms. "Second set of flares ready." "And Carl, Tom says Walker's getting radio traffic from outside. More people coming. Cortez isn't taking any chances," Carl mused. "Sending in reinforcements." Through his scope, he caught Walker directing his teams with hand signals. The former, Deputy, was adapting quickly, using the new lighting conditions to his advantage. He was good, better than Carl had given him credit for. "Getting crowded out here, Henderson," Walker called out. "Last chance to end this clean." Carl's response was another demonstration shot, this one skimming past Walker's ear, so close he could feel the displacement of air. A shot that proved even in these changed conditions, Deadeye Henderson hadn't lost his touch. Clean ended when, "You sold out your badge," Carl replied calmly. "Now we're just deciding how messy it gets." Bill's quiet chuckle came through the radio. "Still showing off after all these years." "Not showing off," Carl corrected, already moving to his next position. "Setting the stage." "Emma, light the next set." "Bill, remember that trick shot sequence from the '82 championships? The one that got banned from competition after you did it? Never could figure out how you made those ricochets work." "About to show you. Might want to cover your ears." The night was about to become very complicated. Walker had studied Carl's competition records, analyzed his documented techniques. But there were some tricks Carl had never used in competition. Some shots he'd practiced in private, preparing for a night exactly like this. Emma's next flares went up, casting new shadows across the battlefield. In the distance, more vehicles were approaching, the reinforcements Walker had called in. Time was becoming a factor. "Tom reports State Police are 30 minutes out," Emma updated them. "And Carl, they're bringing tactical units. This is about to become official." Carl checked his ammunition, each motion precise, despite the growing pressure. "Then we'd better finish this before they get here. Getting too old to explain myself to the authorities." Through his scope, he watched Walker's teams advancing under the new light conditions. They'd adapted well, using the changing shadows for cover, professional shooters learning and adjusting their tactics in real time. "You're surrounded, old man," Walker shouted. "No shame in knowing when you're outmatched." Carl's soft laugh carried across the ranch. "Surrounded? Son, I've spent 15 years setting up this property. Every angle, every shadow, every possible position. This whole ranch is one big shooting gallery. And you just walked your men right into the center of it." The calm before the final confrontation settled over the ranch. In the distance, thunder rolled, a real storm approaching to match the man-made one about to unleash. Carl Henderson, 12-time national champion, the man they called Deadeye, made his final preparations. "Bill, take position 3. Emma, stand by with the last flares. Time to show these boys the difference between being good with a gun and being a true marksman." The reinforcements were getting closer. The state police weren't far behind. Soon, this quiet Texas ranch would become the scene of something that would add new chapters to the legend of Deadeye Henderson. "Remember," Carl said quietly, checking his weapon one final time, "champions aren't made by following the rules. They're made by knowing exactly when to break them." The storm clouds gathered overhead as Carl settled into his final position. Let them come. He'd spent a lifetime preparing for moments like this, perfecting skills that went far beyond simple target shooting. It was time to show them why some legends never fade. The storm broke just as Walker's reinforcements arrived. Lightning illuminated the transformed battlefield of Carl's ranch, where flares and shifting shadows had turned familiar terrain into an ever-changing maze. Through his scope, Carl counted 12 new arrivals, professional shooters by their movement patterns, carrying high-end tactical gear. Getting a bit crowded out there, Bill observed dryly. More targets, same principles, Carl replied, his voice carrying the steady calm that had won him dozens of high-pressure competitions. Emma, start the sequence we discussed. The first of Emma's carefully placed flares erupted, followed by another 30 seconds later. Not random now, but a precise pattern designed to draw eye movement in predictable ways. Carl had learned this trick during night shooting championships, how light and shadow could be used to control where opponents looked. Henderson! Walker's voice carried clear authority now, boosted by the arrival of his reinforcements. You're up against 20 trained shooters. No shame in surrendering to these odds. Carl's response was pure, dead-eye Henderson. 3 shots, in rapid succession, each one catching the tactical lights the new arrivals were setting up, not destroying them, adjusting their angles with surgical precision to create exactly the lighting pattern he wanted. Impressive trick shooting, Walker called out, but there was an edge of uncertainty in his voice now. But tricks won't save you against these numbers. Not tricks, Carl corrected calmly. Mathematics, trajectory calculations, wind compensation. Another shot rang out, splitting raindrops in mid-air between 2 advancing shooters. Things you learn from decades of competitive shooting. The professional shooters were good, adapting quickly to each change in conditions. But Carl had spent 15 years preparing this ground, and now every shadow, every angle, every patch of cover worked to his advantage. They're trying to flank wide, Bill warned, using the storm for cover. Let them, Carl replied, already moving to his next pre-planned position. Emma, Phase 2. Across the ranch, hidden speakers came to life, playing recorded sounds of movement, equipment being shifted, rounds being chambered. Another competition trick, learned from years of dealing with psychological pressure. The professional shooters hesitated, unable to distinguish real threats from false ones in the storm-laden darkness. Walker's frustration showed in his next order. Ignore the distractions. Push in. He can't cover every angle. But that's where Walker had made his crucial mistake. He'd studied Carl's competition records, analyzed his documented techniques. What he hadn't understood was that those competitions had only shown a fraction of Deadeye Henderson's capabilities. Thing about competition shooting, Carl called out, his voice somehow carrying clearly despite the storm, is that there are rules, regulations, standards that have to be followed. 3 more shots rang out in perfect sequence, each one disabling. A different piece of tactical gear without harming its user. Out here, no judges, no scoring committee, just a lifetime of practice and a whole lot of shots I never showed in competition. Lightning flashed again, and in that instant, Carl executed a sequence that would have been impossible in any sanctioned match. 6 shots, fired so rapidly they sounded like a single report, creating a precise pattern of impacts that herded 3 separate teams into exactly the positions he wanted them. Good Lord, Bill breathed, recognizing what his old rival had just done. You've been practicing that for 15 years, haven't you? Longer, Carl admitted, already moving again. Some shots you save for when they're really needed. The storm intensified, rain and wind creating conditions that should have made accurate shooting impossible. But Carl had practiced in weather like this countless times, had learned to read the way wind affected raindrops, how to use the storm itself as another tool in his arsenal. Emma, he called quietly into his radio, time for the finale, just like we planned. The next series of flares created an interlocking pattern of light and shadow, transforming the battlefield one final time. To the professional shooters, already struggling with the storm and Carl's previous tricks, it was like the ground itself had shifted beneath their feet. "What's he doing?" one of the tactical team leaders asked, his voice carrying clear concern. Walker's response was drowned out by thunder, but Carl could read the realization in his body language. The former deputy had finally understood. He hadn't trapped an old champion on his ranch. He'd walked his entire team into a shooting gallery designed by one of the greatest marksmen who ever lived. "Remember," Carl said softly, readying himself for what was to come. "Sometimes the best shot isn't the one you aim at the target." The real demonstration was about to begin. The storm reached its peak as Carl Henderson began his final demonstration. Lightning flashed, and in that instant, his first shot split the difference between two tactical teams, ricocheting off a prepared steel plate to disable the night vision equipment of a third group. Before the thunder could roll, two more shots had created a precise crossfire that trapped Walker's main force in a position Carl had chosen 15 years ago. "What the hell was that?" one of the professionals shouted. "That," Bill's voice carried, across the ranch, was why they called him Deadeye. Carl's next sequence was something that would have been banned from any competition. 5 shots, fired in rapid succession, created a web of ricochets that systematically disarmed half of Walker's remaining force without causing a single injury. Pure geometry and physics, practiced in secret for years. "Impossible," Walker's voice cracked. "Nobody can make shots like that." "Wrong." Carl's reply was calm, professional. "Nobody's supposed to make shots like that. Competition rules don't allow it. But out here, no rules except the ones physics demands." Lightning flashed again, and Carl used its illumination to execute a shooting sequence that turned his entire property into one interconnected firing solution. Bullets curved around obstacles, split differences between moving targets, and created patterns that forced Walker's teams into increasingly untenable positions. "He's not shooting at us," one of the professionals realized aloud. "He's herding us like cattle." "Giving you boys a choice," Carl confirmed, his voice carrying over the storm. "Keep pushing and find out what else I've been practicing all these years, or walk away with a lesson you won't forget." Walker, desperate now, tried one last gambit. "Rush him! He can't track all of us!" But Carl had been waiting for this moment. As the remaining shooters broke cover, he demonstrated why some legends grow stronger with age. His rifle spoke in a continuous rhythm, each shot connecting with mechanical precision. Weapons went flying, tactical gear shattered, carefully planned. Approaches fell apart. "Listen close," Carl called out, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Every shot you've heard aimed to disarm, to disable, to demonstrate. But I've got 15 years of practice on this land, gentlemen. 15 years of learning every angle, every trajectory, every possible shot. Want to see what happens when I stop being careful?" The professional shooters, those who still had working weapons, found their firearms suddenly useless. Precision shots had jammed their actions without damaging them. It was shooting that went beyond skill, beyond even mastery, into something approaching art. "Stand down!" The order came from Walker himself, his voice shaking. "Stand down, damn it!" Thunder rolled across the Texas hills as Walker's team dropped. Their disabled weapons. They'd come expecting to overwhelm an old champion with numbers and technology. Instead, they'd witnessed something that would become its own legend. "Smart decision," Carl said quietly, but his rifle remained ready. "Bill?" "Got Walker in my sights," Bill confirmed. "He's not going anywhere." In the distance, sirens wailed, state police finally arriving. But they'd find a situation already resolved. A confrontation ended, not with bloodshed, but with a display of skill so profound it had turned hardened professionals into witnesses of something extraordinary. "You know what the hardest shot in competition is?" Carl asked conversationally, keeping Walker's team covered. "It's not the long-distance ones, not the speed shoots. It's the shot you choose not to take. The one that proves you're not just skilled, you're wise. Emma's voice came through their radios. State Police 2 minutes out. Tom's with them. Lightning flashed one final time, illuminating the scene. 20 of the best professional shooters in the business stood disarmed and in awe, their weapons disabled by shots that should have been impossible. Walker, his grand plan in ruins, could only stare at the ranch he thought he knew so well. Remember this night, Carl told them as red. And blue lights appeared on the horizon. Remember what you saw here. And next time someone tells you about an old champion living quietly on his ranch, think real careful about whether you want to test that legend. The storm began to ease as state police vehicles pulled up. They'd find no casualties, no serious injuries, just a lot of expensive tactical gear with precision bullet marks that would leave experts scratching their heads for years to come. Deadeye Henderson's last competition had become his greatest demonstration, and the legend had only grown stronger. The morning sun broke over Carl Henderson's ranch, illuminating a landscape transformed by the night's events. State police forensics teams moved carefully through the property, documenting shot patterns that their experts would debate for years to come. Every bullet had been placed with surgical precision, leaving marks that told a story of impossible skill. Never seen anything like it, the lead investigator told Sheriff Tom. 20 professional shooters, all their weapons disabled by shots. That shouldn't have been possible, not a single serious injury. Walker and his tactical team sat in custody, their expressions still showing the shock of what they'd witnessed. The former deputy hadn't said a word since his surrender, but his face told the story of a man who'd learned too late why some legends are best left undisturbed. You know, Bill said, joining Carl on his porch with fresh coffee. They're going to talk about this one. Can't keep it quiet like the old days. Carl watched Emma directing the forensics teams away from his more sensitive preparations. Maybe it's time for some stories to be told. Might keep other folks from making the same. Mistake. Sarah Collins from the local paper was already composing her headline. Deadeye lives, champion shooter's legend grows. She'd have to be careful with the details, but the core of the story would spread. An old champion who proved that true. Mastery only grows stronger with time. What now? Emma asked, joining them on the porch. After this gets out. Now, Carl replied, his hand resting comfortably on his worn revolver. I go back to being just another old rancher. Keep practicing every morning, keep watching the horizon. He smiled slightly, though I expect I'll have fewer uninvited visitors from now on. The Texas sun climbed higher, drying the rain-soaked earth and casting long shadows across a ranch that had become part shooting gallery, part legend. Carl Henderson, the man they called Deadeye, sat in his rocking chair and watched his cattle return to their normal grazing patterns. Some legends, he reflected, grow stronger not because of the stories told about them, but because of the quiet dedication behind those stories. Years of practice, of patience, of preparing for moments everyone else thinks will never come. The sound of his rifle would still echo across the ranch every morning, keeping skills sharp, maintaining the edge that had made him a champion. But those shots carried a new message across the Texas hills. Some legends never fade. They just wait quietly until they're needed again. A month after the confrontation, Carl's ranch had returned to its quiet routine. The forensics teams were long gone. The news vans had moved on to other stories, and the morning sun once again found Deadeye Henderson at his regular practice. Through his scope, he watched a distant target wobble in the early breeze. The shot, when it came, was perfect, just as it had been every morning for the past 15 years. Some habits didn't change, regardless of circumstances. Still at it, I see, Emma called, pulling up in her truck. She'd taken to checking on him more frequently since that night, though they both knew he needed no looking after. Good habits keep you sharp, Carl replied, adjusting his scope minutely. Besides, got a reputation to maintain now. Word had spread through certain circles about what happened that night. Walker's team, now facing lengthy prison sentences, had talked about shots that defied explanation. The legend of Deadeye Henderson had grown, but in a way that brought fewer challenges and more respect. The Texas morning stretched out before them, peaceful and promising. Carl's cattle grazed contentedly, unaware that their pasture doubled as one of the most sophisticated shooting ranges ever created. Some legends, after all, worked best when they stayed quietly in the background, ready but unhurried, just the way Carl Henderson liked it.